And so I walked up to the president of the Paulist, and a voice that was not mine said, "I think I'd really like to help you with this." And he said, "Yeah." So I was thinking that maybe that would be something that would be good for you to do. And I said, "Yeah." So I don't know. He said, "Well," I said, "What do you want? How do you want to handle this?" And he said, "Why don't you go home, write up what you think the national office should be?" And he goes, "Just write it up as best you can." And I said, "Okay." And I said, "Well, that sounds rather daunting." And he goes, "Yeah, really outline it." And he goes, "Tell me all the things that you think should go into this." And I was like, "Okay." And I said, "So I basically have a blank slate to do whatever it is that you want me to do." And he said, "Yeah, pretty much." And I said, "All right." And he goes, "Send it to me by St. Patrick's Day," was January. So I went home, and I was really excited. I was more excited than any time I could remember at that point. I went home, and I wrote that plan that night. I mean, if I could have pulled over to the side of the road and wrote on the back of a cocktail napkin, I would have. I'm from New York. I take the subway. That doesn't happen. But let me tell you, that subway ride home, I was like, let's see, this. Yeah, that's good. I handed it to my roommate, who was not particularly Catholic, and said, "What do you think of this?" And he looked at it and goes, "This is something I'd go to." And I was like, "Really?" And he goes, "Yeah." He said, "This is great." He goes, "The retreat." He goes, "I know the retreats you do are good." He goes, "You come back and you don't shut up about them for 3 weeks." And he said, "But this website idea about sort of taking everyday things and sort of trying to merge those with spiritual experience in some way to show people that these things aren't that far apart." He goes, "Yeah, there's something to that." And he goes, "And answering people's questions, things like this, that's what a lot of people want to know." And he said, "Because it's just such a foreign world to people." I was like, "Okay." I went to my associate pastor. I handed him the plan. He helped me make a few changes, and we sent it to the president of the Paulists, who, the day after St. Patrick's Day, he got back. He called me up and said, "Could I take you to dinner?" And I was like, "Yeah, okay, I could eat." We went out. He took me out for Chinese food. We sat down. The vice president of the Paulists then comes over to our table. He had met us at the restaurant. I was like, these two guys are here. This seems like it's suddenly a very important meeting, and here I am wearing jeans. And he said, "I want to hire somebody for this thing." And he said, "But I think that I want to hire you." And he said, "But I'm not sure if I have to hire one person or two people to do this." He goes, "I'm thinking the first year maybe we just need one, and a Paulist would work with you." I was like, "Well, that sounds good." And I'm sitting in the back of my mind, I'm saying, "Oh, good Lord, he's going to offer me a job that's $20,000 a year, and I'm going to have to tell him no." And he said, "How much do you think you could do that job for?" I said, "I don't know. How much are you asking?" I was about to offer anything because I had in my mind this is a rather low-paying position. And he said, "Well, how does," and he named a price that was nearly double the amount of what I was making in radio. Now, that's a function of radio being very cheap and not the Paulists being very generous, although the Paulists have been very generous to me over the years. And I just looked at him and I was like, this guy just offered me a job doing what I love, and he's going to pay me more money than I was making before? And I was like, so I looked at him and I said, "What time do you want me?" And he kind of laughed. He goes, "Well, it's going to take me a little time to hire you." And he said, "But we got to get a budget together and everything else." He goes, "I'm thinking maybe more like September." And I was like, "It's March." I was like, "There's 6 months to go here." But to end this sort of short segment of my life is that really became what I've been doing for the last 8.5 years. Was starting and continuing to hone this ministry to people in their 20s and 30s. The priest who invited me, Father Brett Hoover, to this focus group ended up becoming my boss. So now I was working with someone who I like and trust and really respected as well. In a nutshell, it all came from a Catholic and a Jew walk into a bar and decide that it sounds like a bad joke, but it really ended up being a great moment of discernment that came from one question. Since then, I've become a spiritual director for many young adults, and I've asked them sort of the same thing in a number of ways. The interesting thing is that as I started studying, and I went back to graduate school during the first few years I worked for the Paulists, and I started studying spiritual direction, and we were studying Ignatian Discernment one day, and I started listening to all the things that you do in Ignatian Discernment. I was like, that's just what Arthur and I did. And I was like, I called him up at home and I said, "You're never going to believe this." I said, "Well," I said, "You know that little process that you did when I was leaving radio and with me?" And he goes, "Yeah." I said, "Well, St. Ignatius thought of that." And he goes, "Wow, a Jewish guy taught you all about St. Ignatius. Who knew?" So what I'd like to do tonight is sort of lead us through a little bit of that, to sort of give you an opportunity to sort of engage in that same kind of process. Here's the one slide that is sort of visual, but I'll see what I can do here. When I was in graduate school, I studied a great Jesuit named Karl Rahner, who some of you may have heard of. Rahner teaches us that life is a journey, that he looks at the way we go through life as a journey, and he says that the journey is really towards something that he calls the infinite horizon. It's a fancy word for God. And that God is this infinite horizon, that when you look out on a horizon, what do you see? You see this thing off in the distance, but you never quite get there. Horizon's always off, just beyond your reach. And he said that's what God is like. God is always sort of just beyond our reach. That we never quite grasp all there is to know or understand about God. And he said that if we knew all there was to understand or to know about God, we'd be God. That's simple. And that God is the source of all of our being, of our creation. We have two what he calls intrinsic drives that God puts within us. And those two drives are to know things and to love things and people in the world. And that those are things that we can't change about ourselves. That God sort of implants those things. They're sort of our natural inclinations, if you will. That you go through life and you can't really fight against these things. And if you do fight against these things, you are literally fighting against God's plan for you. So as we start on this journey through life, we start to come to know the things that are around us in our world, and we start to love other people that are around us. If we're doing that, we're sort of going on that road toward the horizon. The horizon always stays out in the distance, because we don't know everything there is to know about God. But we're sort of traveling at least closer to the horizon, getting to know the horizon a little bit more than we did before. If we fight against these natural inclinations and say, you know what, don't really feel like loving my wife today, we're going the other direction. Does that make sense? That's a semester's worth of Rahner in about 7 seconds. So it's sort of a deep theological concept. The old catechism used to teach this in a very simple way. They would say, who made me? God made me. Why did God make me? God made me to know him, to love him, and to serve him in this world so as to be happy with him in the next. That's sort of a childlike version of the same thing, but it really means essentially what we just said. To know, to love, to serve is the same way as saying to know and to love. So those are our natural inclinations. And the more we are discovering those natural inclinations, the more that we are really discovering who we really are. And I think that's really what Arthur was asking me when I was doing those discernment exercises. He said, Mike, what do you know is really good for you? What do you know are the things that you love? What have you come to know in the world that really sort of helps you express the best part of who you are? When you're with other people that you really get a charge out of, what does that look like? Who is it that you know in the world that you're already sort of fallen in love with in some way that makes you better than you could ever be by yourself?